Relax and listen to the voice. Hans in luck. Hans had served his master for 7 years, so he said to him, "Master, my time is up. Now I should be glad to go back home to my mother. Give me my wages, please." The master answered, "You have served me faithfully and honestly. As the service was, so shall the reward be." And he gave Hans a piece of gold as big as his head. Hans pulled his handkerchief out of his pocket, wrapped up the lump in it, put it on his shoulder, and set out on the way home. As he went on, always putting one foot before the other, he saw a horseman trotting quickly and merrily by on a lively horse. "Ah," said Hans, quite loud, "what a fine thing it is to ride. There you sit as on a chair, you stumble over no stones, you save your shoes and you cover the ground. You don't know how." The rider, who had heard him, stopped and called out, "Hi there, Hans! Why do you go on foot then?" "Well, I must," answered he, "for I have this lump to carry home. It is true that it's gold, but I cannot hold my head straight for it, and it hurts my shoulder." "Well, I will tell you what," said the rider. "We will exchange. I will give you my horse, and you can give me your lump." "With all my heart," said Hans, "but I can tell you, you will have to crawl along with it." The rider got down, took the gold and helped Hans up, then gave him the bridle tight in his hands and said, "If you want to go at a really good pace, you must click your tongue and call out, 'Jup, jup.'" Hans was heartily delighted as he sat upon the horse and rode away so bold and free. After a little while he thought that it ought to go faster, and he began to click with his tongue and call out, "Jup, jup." The horse put himself into a sharp trot, and before Hans knew where he was thrown off and lying in a ditch which separated the field from the highway. The horse would have gone off too if it had not been stopped by a countryman who was coming along the road and driving a cow before him. Hans pulled himself together and stood up on his legs again, but he was vexed, and he said to the countryman, "It is a poor joke, this riding, especially when one gets hold of a mare like this, that kicks and throws one off, so that one has a chance of breaking one's neck. Never again will I mount this beast." "Now, I like your cow, for one can walk quietly behind her and have, over and above, one's milk, butter, and cheese every day without fail. What I would not give to have such a cow." "Well," said the countryman, "if it would give you so much pleasure, I do not mind giving the cow for the horse." Hans agreed with the greatest delight. The countryman jumped upon the horse, and he rode quickly away. Hans drove his cow quietly before him, and thought over his lucky bargain. "If only I had a morsel of bread, and that can hardly fail me. I can eat butter and cheese with it as often as I like. If I'm thirsty, I can milk my cow and drink the milk. My goodness, what more can I want?" When he came to an inn, he made a halt, and in his great concern ate up what he had with him, his dinner and supper, and all he had, and with his last few farthings had to have a glass of beer. Then he drove his cow onwards along the road to his mother's village. As it drew near midday, the heat was more oppressive, and Hans found himself under a moor which it took about an hour to cross. He felt it very hot, and his tongue clave to the roof of his mouth with thirst. "I can find a cure for this," thought Hans. "I will milk the cow now and refresh myself with the milk." He tied her to a withered tree, and as he had no pail he put his leather cap underneath, but try as he would, not a drop of milk came. And as he set himself to work in a clumsy way, the impatient beast at last gave him such a blow on the head with its hind foot that he fell on the ground, and for a long time could not think of where he was. By good fortune, a butcher just then came along the road with a wheelbarrow, in which lay a young pig. "What sort of trick is this?" cried he, and he helped the good Hans up. Hans told him what had happened. The butcher gave him his flask and said, "Take a drink and refresh yourself. The cow will certainly give no milk. It is an old beast at the best, and it's only fit for the plow or for the butcher." "Well, well," said Hans, as he stroked his hair down his head. "Who would have thought it? Certainly it is a fine thing when one can kill a beast like that at home, what meat one has. But I do not care for much beef. It is not juicy enough for me. A young pig like that now is the thing to have. It tastes quite different, and then there are the sausages." "Listen, Hans," said the butcher. "Out of love for you, I will exchange, and I will let you have the pig for the cow." "Heaven repay you for your kindness," said Hans, as he gave up the cow whilst the pig was unbound from the barrow, and the cord by which it was tied was put in his hand. Hans went on, and he thought to himself how everything was going just as he had wished. If he did meet with any vexation, it was immediately set right. Presently there joined him a lad who was carrying a fine white goose under his arm. They said good morning to each other, and Hans began to tell of his good luck, and how he had always made such good bargains. The boy told him that he was taking the goose to a christening feast. "Just lift her," added he, and laid hold of her by the wings. "How heavy she is! She's been fattened up for at least 8 weeks. Whoever has a bit of her when she is roasted will have to wipe the fat from both sides of his mouth." "Yes," said Hans, as he weighed her in one hand. "She is a good weight, but my pig is no bad one." Meanwhile, the lad looked suspiciously from one side to the other, and shook his head. "Look here," he said at length. "It may not be all right with your pig. In the village through which I passed, the mayor himself had just had one stolen out of its sty. I fear that you have gotten a hold of it there. They have sent out some people, and it would be bad business if they caught you with the pig. At the very least, you would be shut up in a dark hole." The good Hans was terrified. "Oh, goodness," he said. "Help me out of this fix. You know more about this place than I do. Take my pig, leave me your goose." "I shall risk something at that game," answered the lad, "but I will not be the cause of your getting in trouble." So he took the cord in his hand, and drove away the pig quickly along a bypath. The good Hans, free from care, went homewards with the goose under his arm. "When I think over it properly," said he to himself, "I have even gained by the exchange. First there is the good roast meat, then the quantity of fat which will drip from it, and which will give me drippings for my bread for a quarter of a year, and lastly the beautiful white feathers. I will have my pillow stuffed with them, and then I indeed shall go to sleep without rocking. How glad my mother will be." As he was going through the last village, there stood a scissor grinder with his barrow, and his wheel whirred, and he sang, "I sharpen my scissors and quickly grind, my coat blows out in the wind behind." Hans stood still and looked at him. At last he spoke to him and said, "All's well with you, as you are so merry with your grinding." "Yes," answered the scissor grinder, "the trade has a golden foundation. A real grinder is a man who, as often as he puts his hand into his pocket, finds gold in it. But where did you buy that fine goose?" "Well, I did not buy it, but I exchanged my pig for it." "And the pig?" "Well, that I got for a cow." "And the cow?" "I took that instead of a horse." "And the horse?" "For that I gave up a lump of gold as big as my head." "Well, and the gold?" "Well, that was my wages for 7 years of service." "You have known how to look after yourself each time," said the grinder. "If you can only get on so far as to hear the money jingle in your pocket whenever you stand up, you will have made your fortune." "Well, how shall I manage that?" said Hans. "You must be a grinder, as I am. Nothing particular is wanted for it but a grindstone. The rest finds itself. I have one here. It's certainly a little bit worn, but you need not give me anything for it but your goose. Will you do it?" "How can you ask?" answered Hans. "I shall be the luckiest fellow on earth. If I have money whenever I put my hand in my pocket, why should I ever worry again?" And he handed him the goose, and received the grindstone in exchange. "Now," said the grinder, as he took up an ordinary heavy stone that lay by him, "here is a strong stone for you into the bargain. You can hammer well upon it, and straighten your old nails. Take it with you, and keep it carefully." Hans loaded himself with stones, and went on with a contented heart, his eyes shining with joy. "I must have been born with a call," he cried. "Everything I want happens to me just as if I were a Sunday child." Meanwhile, as he had been on his legs since daybreak, he began to feel tired. Hunger also tormented him, for in his joy at the bargain by which he got the cow, he had eaten up all of his store of food at once. At last he could only go on with great trouble, and was forced to stop every minute. The stones, too, weighed him down dreadfully. Then he could not help thinking how nice it would be if he had not had to carry them just then. He crept like a snail to a well in a field, and there he thought that he would rest and refresh himself with a cool draught of water. But in order that he might not injure the stones in sitting down, he laid them carefully by his side on the edge of the well. Then he sat down on it, and was to stoop and drink, when he made a slip, pushed against the stones, and both of them fell into the water. When Hans saw them with his own eyes sinking to the bottom, he jumped for joy, and then knelt down, and with tears in his eyes thanked God for having shown him this favor also, delivered him in so good a way, and without his having any need to reproach himself from those heavy stones which had been the only things that troubled him. "There is no man under the sun as fortunate as I," he cried out. With a light heart and free from every burden, he now ran on until he was with his mother at home. Hans married. There was once upon a time a young peasant named Hans, whose uncle wanted to find him a rich wife. He therefore seated Hans behind his stove, and had it made very hot. Then he fetched a pot of milk and plenty of white bread, gave him a bright newly coined farthing in his hand, and said, "Hans, hold that farthing fast. Crumble the white bread into the milk, and stay where you are. Do not stir from that spot until I come back." "Yes," said Hans, "I will do all of that." Then the uncle put on a pair of old patched trousers, went to a rich peasant's daughter in the next village, and said, "Won't you marry my nephew Hans? You will get an honest and sensible man who will suit you." The covetous father asked, "How is it with regard to his means? Has he bread to break?" "Dear friend," replied the uncle, "my young nephew has a snug berth, a nice bit of money in hand, and plenty of bread to break. Besides, he has quite as many patches as I have." And as he spoke, he slapped the patches on his trousers, but in that district small pieces of land were called patches also. "If you will give yourself the trouble to go home with me, you shall see at once that all is as I have said." Then the miser did not want to lose this good opportunity, and said, "I have nothing further to say against this marriage." So the wedding was celebrated on this appointed day, and when the young wife went out of doors to see the bridegroom's property, Hans took off his Sunday coat and put on his patched smock and said, "I might spoil my good coat." Then they together went out, and wherever a vineyard came in sight, where fields and meadows were divided from each other, Hans pointed with his finger, and then slapped either a large or small patch on his smock, and said, "That patch is mine, and that too, my dearest. Just look at it," meaning thereby that his wife should not stare at the broad land, but look at his garment, in which he was slapping, and which was his own. "Were you at the wedding too?" "Yes, indeed I was there, and in full dress. My headdress was of snow. Then the sun came out, and it was melted. My coat was of cobwebs, and I had to pass by some thorns which tore it off of me. My shoes were of glass, and I trod on a stone, and they said, 'Clink,' and broke into two." The Gold Children. There was once a poor man and a poor woman who had nothing but a little cottage, and who earned their bread by fishing, and always lived from hand to mouth. But it came to pass one day, when the man was sitting by the waterside and casting his net, that he drew out a fish entirely of gold. As he was looking at the fish, full of astonishment, it began to speak and said, "Listen, fisherman, if you will throw me back again into the water, I will change your little hut into a splendid castle." Then the fisherman answered, "Of what use is a castle to me, if I have nothing to eat?" The goldfish continued, "That shall be taken care of. There will be a cupboard in the castle in which, when you open it, shall be dishes of the most delicate meats, and as many of them as you can desire." "If that be true," said the man, "then I can well do you a favor." "Yes," said the fish. "There is, however, the condition that you shall disclose to no one in the world, whosoever he may be, whence your good luck has come. If you speak but one single word, all will be over." Then the man threw the wonderful fish back again into the water and went home. But where his hovel had formerly stood, now stood a great castle. He opened wide his eyes, entered, and saw his wife dressed in beautiful clothes, sitting in a splendid room, and she was quite delighted, and said, "Husband, how has all this come to pass? It suits me very well." "Yes," said the man, "it suits me well too, but I'm frightfully hungry. Just give me something to eat," said the wife. "But I have got nothing, and I don't know where to find anything in this new house." "There's no need of your knowing," said the man, "for I see yonder a great cupboard. Just unlock it." When she opened it, there stood cakes, meat, fruit, wine. Quite a bright prospect. Then the woman cried joyfully, "What more can you want, my dear?" And they sat down and ate and drank together. When they had had enough, the woman said, "But husband, whence come all the riches?" "Alas," answered he, "do not question me about it, for I dare not tell you anything. If I disclose it to anyone, then all of our good fortune will disappear." "Very good," said she. "If I am not to know anything, then I do not want to know anything." However, she was not in earnest. She never rested day or night, and she goaded her husband until in his impatience he revealed that all was owing to a wonderful golden fish which he had caught, and to which in return he had given its liberty. And as soon as the secret was out, the splendid castle with the cupboard immediately disappeared. They were once more in the old fisherman's hut, and the man was obliged to follow his former trade in fish. But fortune would so have it that he once more drew out a golden fish. "Listen," said the fish, "if you will throw me back into the water again, I will once more give you the castle with a cupboard full of roast and boiled meats. Only be firm, for your life's sake. Don't reveal from whom you have it, or you will lose it all again." "I will take good care this time," answered the fisherman, and threw the fish back into the water. Now at home, everything was once more in its former magnificence, and the wife was overjoyed at their good fortune, but curiosity once again left her no peace, so that after a couple of days she began to ask how it had come to pass, and how he had managed to secure it. The man kept silence for a short time, but at last she made him so angry that he broke out and betrayed the secret. In an instant the castle disappeared, and they were back again in their old hut. "Now you have got what you want," said he, "and we can gnaw bare bone again." "Ah," said the woman, "I had rather not have riches if I am not to know from whom they come, for then I have no peace." The man went back to fish, and after a while he chanced to draw out the goldfish for a third time. "Listen," said the fish, "I see very well that I am fated to fall into your hands. Take me home and cut me into 6 pieces. Give your wife 2 of them to eat, 2 to your horse, and bury 2 of them in the ground. Then they will bring you a blessing." The fisherman took the fish home with him, and did as it had bidden him. It came to pass, however, that from the 2 pieces that were buried in the ground, 2 golden lilies sprang up, that the horse had 2 golden foals, and the fisherman's wife bore 2 children who were made entirely of gold. The children grew up, became tall and handsome, and the lilies and horses grew likewise. Then they said, "Father, we want to mount our golden steeds and travel out into the world." But he only answered sorrowfully, "How shall I bear it if you go away, and I know not how it fares with you?" Then they said, "The 2 golden lilies remain here. By them you can see how it is with us. If they are fresh, then we are in health. If they are withered, we are ill. If the golden lilies perish, then we are dead." So they rode forth and came to an inn, in which were many people, and when they perceived the gold children they began to laugh and jeer. When one of them heard the mocking, he felt ashamed and would not go out into the world, but turned back and went home again to his father. The other rode forward and reached a great forest. As he was about to enter it, the people said, "It's not safe for you to go riding through. The wood is full of robbers who would treat you badly. You will fare ill, and when they see that you are all of gold, you and your horse likewise, they will assuredly kill you." But he would not allow himself to be frightened, and said, "I must and will ride through it." Then he took bearskins and covered himself and his horse with them, so that the gold was no more to be seen, and he rode fearlessly into the forest. When he had ridden onward a little, he heard a rustling in the bushes, and heard voices speaking together. From one side came cries of, "There is one," but from the other, "Let him go! 'Tis a bearskin, as poor and bare as a church mouse. What should we gain from him?" So the gold child rode joyfully through the forest, and no evil befell him. One day he entered a village wherein he saw a maiden who was so beautiful that he did not believe that any more beautiful than she existed in the whole world, and as such a mighty love took possession of him, he went up to her and said, "I love you with my whole heart. Will you be my wife?" He, too, pleased the maiden so much that she agreed and said, "Yes, I will be your wife, and be true to you my whole life long." Then they were married, and just as they were in the greatest happiness, home came the father of the bride. He was astonished, and said, "Where is the bridegroom?" They showed him the gold child, who, however, still wore his bearskins. Then the father said wrathfully, "A bearskin shall never have my daughter," and he was about to kill him. Then the bride begged as hard as she could and said, "He is my husband, and I love him with all of my heart," until at last he allowed himself to be appeased. Nevertheless, the idea never left his thoughts, so that the next morning he rose early, wishing to see whether his daughter's husband was a common ragged beggar. But when he peeped in, he saw a magnificent golden man in the bed, and the cast-off bearskins lying on the ground. Then he went back and thought, "What a good thing it is that I restrained my anger. I would have committed a great crime." The gold child dreamed that he rode out to hunt a splendid stag, and when he awoke in the morning, he said to his wife, "I must go out hunting." She was uneasy and begged him to stay there, and said, "You might easily meet with great misfortune." But he answered, "I must and will go." Thereupon he got up and rode forth into the forest, and it was not long before a fine stag crossed his path exactly according to his dream. He aimed and was about to shoot it, when the stag ran away. He gave chase over hedges and ditches for the whole day without feeling tired, but in the evening the stag had vanished from his sight, and when the gold child looked around him, he was standing before a little house wherein sat a witch. He knocked, and the little old woman came out and asked, "What are you doing so late in the midst of the great forest?" "Have you not seen a stag?" "Yes," answered she, "I know the stag well." And thereupon the little dog which had come out of the house with her barked at the man violently. "Will you be silent, you odious toad?" said he, "or I will shoot you dead." Then the witch cried out in a passion, "What, will you slay my little dog?" and immediately transformed him, so that he lay like a stone, and his bride awaited him in vain, and thought, "That which I so greatly dreaded, which lay so heavily upon my heart, has finally come upon him." But at home the other brother was standing by the gold lilies, when one of them suddenly drooped. "Good heavens," said he, "my brother has met with some great misfortune. I must go away to see if I can possibly rescue him." Then the father said, "Stay here. If I lose you also, what shall I do?" But he answered, "I must and will go forth." Then he mounted his golden horse, and rode forth, and entered the great forest where his brother lay turned to stone. The old witch came out of her house and called him, wishing to entrap him also, but he did not go near her, and said, "I will shoot you if you will not bring my brother to life again." She touched the stone, though very unwillingly, with her forefinger, and he was immediately restored to his human shape, and the two gold children rejoiced when they saw each other again. They kissed and caressed each other, and rode away together out of the forest, the one home to his bride, and the other to his father. The father then said, "I knew well that you had rescued your brother, for the golden lily suddenly rose up and blossomed out again." And then they lived happily, and they prospered until their death. The Peasant's Wise Daughter. There once was a poor peasant who had no land, but only a small house and one daughter. Then said the daughter, "We ought to ask our lord the king for a bit of newly cleared land." When the king heard of their poverty, he presented them with a piece of land, which she and her father dug up, and intended to sow with a little corn and grain of that kind. When they had dug nearly the whole of the field, they found in the earth a mortar made of pure gold. "Listen," said the father to the girl. "As our lord the king has been so gracious and presented us with the field, we ought to give him this mortar in return for it." The daughter, however, would not consent to this, and said, "Father, if we have the mortar without having the pestle as well, we shall have to get the pestle, so you had much better say nothing about it." But he would not obey her, and took the mortar and carried it to the king, said that he had found it in the cleared land, and asked if he would accept it as a present. The king took the mortar, and asked if he had found nothing besides that. "No," answered the countryman. Then the king said that he must now bring him the pestle. The peasant said that they had not found that, but he might just as well have spoken to the wind, as he was put into prison, and was to stay there until he produced the pestle. The servants had daily to carry him bread and water, which is what people get in prison, and they heard how the man cried out continually, "Ah, if I had but listened to my daughter! Alas, alas, if I had but listened to my daughter!" and would neither eat nor drink. So the king commanded the servants to bring the prisoner before him, and then the king asked the peasant why he was always crying, "Ah, but if I had listened to my daughter," and what it was that his daughter had said. "Well, she told me that I ought not to take the mortar to you, for I should have to produce the pestle as well." "If you have a daughter who is as wise as that, let her come here." She was therefore obliged to appear before the king, who asked her if she was really so wise, and said that he would set her a riddle, and if she could guess that, he would marry her. She at once said yes, she would guess it. Then said the king, "Come to me not clothed, not naked, not riding, not walking, not in the road, and not off the road, and if you can do that, I will marry you." So she went away, put off everything she had on, and then she was not clothed, and took a great fishing net, and seated herself in it, and wrapped it entirely around and around her, so that she was not naked, and she hired an ass, and tied the fisherman's net to its tail, so that it was forced to drag her along, and that was neither riding nor walking. The ass had also to drag her in the ruts, so that she only touched the ground with her big toe, and that was neither being in the road nor off the road. And when she arrived in that fashion, the king said she had guessed the riddle, and fulfilled all of the conditions. Then he ordered her father to be released from the prison, took her to wife, and gave into her care of all the royal possessions. Now, when some years had passed, the king was once reviewing his troops on parade, and when it happened that some peasants who had been selling wood stopped their wagon before the palace, some of them had oxen yoked to them, and some horses. There was one peasant who had 3 horses, one of which was delivered of a young foal, and it ran away and lay down between 2 oxen which were in front of the wagon. When the peasants came together, they began to dispute, to beat each other and to make a disturbance, and the peasant with the oxen wanted to keep the foal, and said one of the oxen had given birth to it, and the other said his horse had had it, and that it was his. The quarrel came before the king, and he was to give the verdict that the foal should stay where it had been found, and so the peasant with the oxen, to whom it did not belong, got the foal. Then the other went away, and wept and lamented over his foal. Now he had heard how gracious his lady the queen was, because she herself had sprung up from poor peasant folk. So he went to her and begged her to see if she could not help him get his foal back again. Said she, "Yes, I will tell you what to do, if you will promise me not to betray me. Early tomorrow morning, when the king parades the guard, place yourself there in the middle of the road by which he must pass. Take a great fishing net and pretend to be fishing. Go on fishing, and empty out the net as if you had got it full." And then she told him also what he was to say if he was questioned by the king. The next day, therefore, the peasant stood there and fished on dry ground. When the king passed by and saw that, he sent his messenger to ask what the stupid man was about. He answered, "Oh, I'm fishing." The messenger asked how he could fish when there was no water there. The peasant said, "It is as easy for me to fish on dry land as it is for an ox to have a foal." The messenger went back and took the answer to the king, who ordered the peasant to be brought to him, and told him that this was not his idea, and he wanted to know whose it was. The peasant, said the king, must confess this at once. The peasant, however, would not do so, and said always, "God forbid he should. The idea was his own." So they laid him on a heap of straw, and they beat him and tormented him so long that at last he had admitted that he got the idea from the queen. When the king reached home again, he said to his wife, "Why have you behaved so falsely to me? I will not have you any longer for a wife. Your time is up. Go back to the place from whence you came, to your peasant's hut." One favor, however, he granted her. She might take with her the one thing that was dearest and best in her eyes, and thus she was dismissed. She said, "Yes, my dear husband, if you command this, I will do it." And she embraced him and kissed him, and said she would take leave of him. Then she ordered a powerful sleeping draught to be brought, to drink farewell to him. The king took a long draught, but she took only a little. He soon fell into a deep sleep, and when she perceived that, she called a servant and took a fair white linen cloth and wrapped the king in it. And the servant was forced to carry him into a carriage that stood before the door, and she drove with him to her little house. She laid him under her own little bed, and he slept 1 day and 1 night without awakening, and when he awoke, he looked around and said, "Good God, where am I?" He called his attendants, but none of them were there. At length, his wife came to his bedside and said, "My dear lord and king, you told me I might bring away with me from the palace that which was dearest and most precious in my eyes. I have nothing more precious and dear than yourself, so I have brought you with me." Tears rose up in the king's eyes, and he said, "Dear wife, you shall be mine and I will be yours." And he took her back with him to the royal palace and was married again to her, and at the present time they are very likely still loving and living. The Singing, Soaring Lark. There was once upon a time a man who was about to set out on a long journey, and on parting he asked his 3 daughters what he should bring back with him for them. Whereupon the eldest wished for pearls, the second wished for diamonds, but the third said, "Dear father, I should like a singing, soaring lark." The father said, "Yes, if I can get it, you shall have it." He kissed all 3, and he set out. Now when the time had come for him to be on his way home again, he had brought pearls and diamonds for his 2 eldest, but he had sought everywhere in vain for a singing, soaring lark for the youngest, and he was very unhappy about it, for she was his favorite child. Then his road lay through a forest, and in the midst of it was a splendid castle, and near the castle stood a tree, but quite on top of the tree he saw a singing, soaring lark. "Aha, you come just at the right moment," he said, quite delighted, and he called to his servant to climb up and catch the little creature. But as he approached the tree, a lion leapt from beneath it, shook himself, and roared until the leaves on the trees trembled. "He who tries to steal my singing, soaring lark," he cried, "will I devour." Then the man said, "I did not know that the bird belonged to you. I will make amends for the wrong I have done and ransom myself with a large sum of money. Only spare my life, please." The lion said, "Nothing can save you unless you will promise to give me for my own what first meets you on your return home. And if you will do that, I will grant you your life, and you shall have the bird for your daughter into the bargain." But the man hesitated and said, "Well, that might be my youngest daughter. She loves me best, and always runs to meet me on my return home." The servant, however, was terrified and said, "Why should your daughter be the very one to meet you? It might be easily a cat or a dog." And then the man allowed himself to be persuaded. He took the singing, soaring lark, and promised to give the lion whatsoever should first meet him on his return home. When he reached home and entered his house, the first who met him was no other than his youngest and dearest daughter, who came running up, kissed and embraced him, and when she saw that he had brought with him a singing, soaring lark, she was beside herself with joy. The father, however, could not rejoice, but began to weep, and said, "My dearest child, I have bought the little bird, dear. In return for it, I have been obliged to promise you to a savage lion, and when he has you, he will tear you in pieces and devour you." And he told her all, just as it had happened, and begged her not to go there, come whatever might. But she consoled him and said, "Dearest father,
Indeed, your promise must be fulfilled. I will go thither and soften the lion, so that I may return to you safely."
The next morning she had the road pointed out to her. She took leave and went fearlessly out into the forest. The lion, however, was an enchanted prince, and was by day a lion, and all his people were lions with him, but in the night they resumed their natural human shapes. On her arrival, she was kindly received and led into the castle. When night came, the lion turned into a handsome man, and their wedding was celebrated with great magnificence. They lived happily together, remained awake at night, and slept in the daytime. One day he came and said, "Tomorrow there is a feast in your father's house, because your eldest sister is to be married, and if you are inclined to go there, my lion shall conduct you." She said,
"Yes, I should very much like to see my father again,"
and went thither, accompanied by the lions. There was a great joy when she arrived, for they had all believed that she had been torn in pieces by the lion, and had long ceased to live. But she told them what a handsome husband she had, and how well off she was, remained with them while the wedding feast lasted, and then went back again to the forest. When the second daughter was about to be married, and she was again invited to the wedding, she said to the lion,
"This time I will not be alone. You must come with me."
The lion, however, said that it was too dangerous for him, for if when their ray from a burning candle fell on him, he would be changed into a dove, and for 7 years long would have to fly about with the doves.
She said, "Ah, but do come with me. I will take great care of you, and guard you from all the light."
So they went away together, and took with them their little child as well. She had a room built there, so strong and thick that no ray could pierce through it. In this he was to shut himself up when the candles were lit for the wedding feast. But the door was made of green wood, which warped and left a little crack which no one noticed. The wedding was celebrated with magnificence, but when a procession with all of its candles and torches came back from church and passed by this apartment, a ray touched him, and he was transformed in an instant. And when she came in and looked for him, she did not see him, but a white dove was sitting there. The dove said to her,
"For 7 years must I fly about the world, but at every 7th step that you take, I will let fall a drop of red blood and a white feather, and these will show you the way. And if you follow the trace, you can release me."
Thereupon the dove flew out at the door, and she followed him, and at every 7th step, a red drop of blood and a little white feather fell down and showed her the way. So she went continually further and further into the wide world, never looking about her or resting. And the 7 years were almost past. Then she rejoiced and thought that they would soon be saved, and yet they were so far away from it. Once, when they were thus moving onwards, no little feather and no drop of red blood fell, and when she raised her eyes, the dove had disappeared. And as she thought to herself, "In this no man can help you," she climbed up to the sun, and said to him, "You shine into every crevice and over every peak. Have you not seen a white dove flying?"
"No," said the sun, "I have seen none, but I present you with a casket. Open it when you are in sorest need."
Then she thanked the sun, and went on until evening came and the moon appeared. She then asked her,
"You shine the whole night through, and on every field and forest. Have you not seen a white dove flying?" "No," said the moon, "I have seen no dove, but here I give you an egg. Break it when you are in great need."
She thanked the moon, and went on until the night wind came up and blew on her. Then she said to it,
"You blow over every tree and under every leaf. Have you not seen a white dove flying?"
"No," said the night wind, "I have seen none, but I will ask the 3 other winds. Perhaps they have seen it." The east wind and the west wind came, and had seen nothing, but the south wind said, "I have seen the white dove. It has flown to the Red Sea, where it has become a lion again, for the 7 years are over, and the lion is there fighting with a dragon. The dragon, however, is an enchanted princess." The night wind then said to her, "I will advise you. Go to the Red Sea. On the right bank are some tall reeds. Count them.
break off the 11th and strike the dragon with it. Then the lion will be able to subdue it, and both then will regain their human forms. After that, look around and you will see the griffin, which is by the Red Sea. Swing yourself with your beloved onto his back, and the bird will carry you over the sea to your own home. Here's a nut for you. When you are above the center of the sea, let the nut fall. It will immediately shoot up, and a tall nut tree will grow out of the water on which the griffin may rest. For if the griffin cannot rest, he will not be strong enough to carry you across. And if you forget to throw down the nut, he will let you fall into the sea.
Then she went thither, and found everything as the night wind had said. She counted the reeds by the sea, and cut off the 11th, struck the dragon therewith, whereupon the lion conquered it, and immediately both of them regained their human shapes. But when the princess, who hitherto had been the dragon, was released from enchantment, she took the youth by the arm, seated herself on the griffin, and carried him off with her. There stood the poor maiden who had wandered so far and was again forsaken. She sat down and cried, but at last she took courage and said,
Still, I will go as far as the wind blows and as long as the cock crows, until I find him.
And she went forth by long, long roads, until at last she came to the castle where both of them were living together. There she heard that soon a feast was to be held, in which they would celebrate their wedding. But she said,
God still help me,
and opened the casket that the sun had given her. A dress lay therein, as brilliant as the sun itself, so she took it out, put it on, and went up into the castle, and everyone, even the bride herself, looked at her with astonishment. The dress pleased the bride so well that she thought it might do for her wedding dress, and asked if it was for sale.
Not for money or land, answered she, but for flesh and blood.
The bride asked her what she meant by that, so she said,
Let me sleep at night in the chamber where the bridegroom sleeps.
The bride would not, yet wanted very much to have the dress. At last she consented, but the page was to give the prince a sleeping draught. When it was night, therefore, and the youth was already asleep, she was led into the chamber. She seated herself on the bed and said,
I have followed after you for 7 years. I have been to the sun and the moon and the 4 winds. I have inquired for you, and have helped you against the dragon. Will you then quite forget me?
But the prince slept so soundly that it only seemed to him as if the wind were whistling outside in the fir trees. When therefore day broke, she was led out again, and had to give up the golden dress. And as that had even been to no avail, she was sad, and went out into the meadow, sat down there, and wept. While she was sitting there, she thought of the egg which the moon had given her, and she opened it, and there came out a clucking hen with 12 chickens, all of gold, and they ran about chirping, and crept again under the old hen's wings. Nothing more beautiful was ever seen in the world. Then she arose and drove them through the meadow before her, until the bride looked out of the window. The little chickens pleased her so much that she immediately came down and asked if they were for sale.
Not for money or for land, but for flesh and blood. Let me sleep another night in the chamber where the bridegroom sleeps.
The bride said yes, intending to cheat her as she had on the former evening. But when the prince went to bed, he asked the page what the murmuring and rustling in the night had been. On this, the page told all, that he had been forced to give him a sleeping draught, because a poor girl had slept secretly in the chamber, and that he was to give him another that night. The prince said, Pour out the draught by the bedside. At night she was again led in, and when she began to relate how ill all had fared with her, he immediately recognized his beloved wife by her voice. He sprang up and cried, Now I really am released. I have been as it were in a dream, for the strange princess has bewitched me, so that I have been compelled to forget you, but God has delivered me from the spell at just the right time. Then they both left the castle secretly in the night, for for they feared the father of the princess, who was a sorcerer, and they seated themselves on the griffin which bore them across the Red Sea. And when they were in the midst of it, she let fall the nut. Immediately a tall nut tree grew up, whereon the bird rested, and then carried them home, where they found their child, who had grown tall and beautiful, and had lived thenceforth happily until their deaths. The Goose Girl. There was once upon a time an old queen whose husband had been dead for many years, and she had a beautiful daughter. When the princess grew up, she was betrothed to a prince who lived at a great distance. When the time came for her to be married, and she had to journey forth into the distant kingdom, the aged queen packed up for her many costly vessels of silver and gold, and trinkets also of gold and silver, and cups and jewels. In short, everything which appertained to a royal dowry, for she loved her child with all of her heart. She likewise sent her maid-in-waiting, who was to ride with her, and hand her over to the bridegroom, and each had a horse for the journey, but the horse of the king's daughter was called Falada, and could speak. So when the hour of parting had come, the aged mother went into her bedroom, took a small knife, and cut her finger with it until it bled. Then she held a white handkerchief to it, into which she let 3 drops of blood fall, gave it to her daughter, and said, "Dear child, preserve this carefully. It will be of service to you on your way." So they took a sorrowful leave of each other. The princess put the piece of cloth in her bosom, mounted her horse, and they went away to her bridegroom. After she had ridden for a while, she felt a burning thirst, and said to her waiting maid,
"Dismount, and take my cup which you have brought for me, and get me some water from the stream, for I should like to drink." "If you are thirsty," said the waiting maid, "get off your horse yourself, and lie down and drink out of the water. I don't choose to be your servant."
So in her great thirst the princess alighted, bent down over the water in the stream, and drank, and was not allowed to drink out of the golden cup. Then she said,
"Ah, heaven!"
and the 3 drops of blood answered,
"If this your mother knew, her heart would break in two."
But the king's daughter was humble, said nothing, and mounted her horse again. She rode some miles further, but the day was warm. The sun scorched her, and she was thirsty once more. And when they came to a stream of water, she again cried to her waiting maid,
"Dismount, and give me some water in my golden cup."
for she had long ago forgotten the girl's ill word. But the waiting maid said still and more haughtily,
"If you wish to drink, get it yourself. I don't choose to be your maid."
Then in her great thirst the king's daughter alighted, bent over the flowing stream, wept, and said,
"Ah, heaven!"
And the drops of blood again replied,
"If this your mother knew, her heart would break in two."
And as she was thus drinking and leaning right over the stream, the handkerchief with the 3 drops of blood fell out of her bosom and floated away with the water without her observing it, so great was her trouble. The waiting maid, however, had seen it, and she rejoiced to think that the bride had no power over her, for since the princess had lost the drops of blood, she had become weak and powerless. So now when she wanted to mount her horse again, the one that was called Falada, the waiting maid said,
"Falada is more suitable for me, and my nag will do for you."
and the princess had to be content with that. Then the waiting maid, with many hard words, bade the princess exchange her royal apparel for her own shabby clothes, and at length she was compelled to swear by the clear sky above her that she would not say one word of this to anyone at the royal court. And if she had not taken this oath, she would have been killed on the spot. But Falada saw all of this, and observed it well. The waiting maid now mounted Falada, and the true bride the bad horse, and thus they traveled onwards, until at length they entered the royal palace. There were great rejoicings over her arrival, and the prince sprang forward to meet her, lifting the waiting maid from her horse, and thought that she was his consort. She was conducted upstairs, but the real princess was left standing below. Then the old king looked out of his window and saw her standing in the courtyard, and noticed how dainty and delicate and beautiful she was. He instantly went to the royal apartment, and asked the bride about the girl she had with her who was standing down below in the courtyard, and who she was.
"I picked her up on my way for a companion. Give the girl something to work at, that she might not stand idle."
But the old king had no work for her, and knew of none, so he said, "I have a little boy who tends the geese. She may help him." The boy was called Conrad, and the true bride had to help him to tend the geese. Soon afterwards, the false bride said to the young king,
"Dearest husband, I beg you to do me a favor."
He answered, "I will do so most willingly."
"Then send for the knacker, and have the head of the horse on which I rode here cut off, for it vexed me on the way."
In reality, she was afraid that the king's horse might tell how she had behaved to the king's daughter. Then she succeeded in making the king's promise that it should be done, and the faithful Falada was to die. This came to the ears of the real princess, and she secretly promised to pay the knacker a piece of gold if he would perform a small service for her. There was a great dark-looking gateway in the town, through which morning and evening she had to pass with the geese. Would he be so good as to nail up Falada's head on it, so that she might see him again more than once? The knacker's man promised to do that, and cut off the head, and nailed it fast beneath the dark gateway. Early in the morning, when she and Conrad drove out their flock beneath this gateway, she said in passing,
"Alas, Falada hanging there."
The head answered,
Alas, young queen, how ill you fare! If this your mother knew, her heart would break in two.
Then they went still further out of the town, and drove their geese into the country. And when they had come to the meadow, she sat down and unbound her hair, which was like pure gold. And Conrad saw it and delighted in its brightness, and wanted to pluck out a few hairs. Then she said,
"Blow, blow, thou gentle wind, I say, blow Conrad's little hat away, and make him chase it here and there, until I have braided all my hair, and bound it up again."
And there came such a violent wind that it blew Conrad's hat far away across the country, and he was forced to run after it. When he came back, she had finished combing her hair and was putting it up again, and he could not get any of it. Then Conrad was angry, and would not speak to her, and thus they watched the geese until the evening, and then they went home. The next day, when they were driving the geese out through the dark gateway, the maiden said,
"Alas, Falada hanging there."
Falada answered,
Alas, young queen, how ill you fare! If this your mother knew, her heart would break in two.
And she sat down again in the field and began to comb out her hair, and Conrad ran and tried to clutch it. So she said in haste,
"Blow, blow, thou gentle wind, I say, blow Conrad's little hat away, and make him chase it here and there, until I have braided all my hair, and bound it up again."
Then the wind blew and blew his little hat off his head and far away, and Conrad was forced to run after it. And when he came back, her hair had been put up a long time, and he could get none of it, and so they looked after the geese until evening came. But in the evening, after they had gotten home, Conrad went to the old king and said,
"I won't tend the geese with that girl any longer."
Why not?
inquired the aged king.
"Oh, because she vexes me the whole day long."
Then the aged king commanded him to relate what it was that she did to him, and Conrad said,
"In the morning, when we pass beneath the dark gateway with the block, there is a horse's head on the wall, and she says to it, 'Alas, Falada, hanging there.' And then the head replies, 'Alas, young queen, how ill you fare! If this your mother knew, her heart would break in two.'"
And Conrad went on to relate what happened on the goose pasture, and how when there he had to chase his hat. The aged king commanded him to drive his flock out again the next day, and as soon as morning came, he placed himself behind the dark gateway, and he heard how the maiden spoke to the head of Falada, and then he too went into the country, and he hid himself in the thicket in the meadow. There he soon saw with his own eyes the goose girl and the goose boy bringing their flock, and how after a while she sat down and unplaited her hair, which shone with radiance. And soon she said, "Blow, blow, thou gentle wind, I say, blow Conrad's little hat away, and make him chase it here and there, until I have braided all my hair, and bound it up again." Then came a blast of wind and carried off Conrad's hat, so that he had to run far away, while the maiden quietly went on combing and plaiting her hair, all of which the king observed. Then, quite unseen, he went away, and when the goose girl came home in the evening, he called her aside and asked why she did all these things.
"I may not tell that. and I dare not lament my sorrows to any human being, for I have sworn not to do so by the heaven which is above me. If I had not done that, I should have lost my life."
He urged her and left her no peace, but he could draw nothing from her. Then said he, "If you will not tell me anything, tell your sorrows to the iron stove there." And he went away. Then she crept into the iron stove, and began to weep and lament, and emptied her whole heart, and said,
"Here I am deserted by the whole world, and yet I am the king's daughter, and I have a false waiting maid that has by force brought me to such a pass that I have been compelled to put off my royal apparel, and she has taken my place with my bridegroom, and I have to perform menial service as a goose girl. If this my mother knew, her heart would break in two."
The aged king, however, was standing outside by the pipe of the stove, and was listening to what she said, and he heard it all. Then he came back again, and bade her to come out of the stove, and royal garments were placed on her, and it was marvelous how beautiful she was. The aged king summoned his son, and revealed to him that he had gotten the false bride, who was only a waiting maid, but that the true one was standing there, as a former goose girl. The young king rejoiced with all of his heart when he saw her beauty and her youth, and a great feast was made ready, to which all the people and all good friends were invited. At the head of the table sat the bridegroom with the king's daughter at one side of him, and the waiting maid on the other. But the waiting maid was blinded, and did not recognize the princess in her dazzling array. When they had eaten and drunk, and were merry, the aged king asked the waiting maid as a riddle what punishment a person deserved who had behaved in such and such a way to her master, and at the same time related the whole story, and asked what sentence such a person merited. Then the false bride said,
"She deserves no better fate than to be stripped entirely naked, and put in a barrel which is studded inside with pointed nails, and 2 white horses should be harnessed to it, which will drag her along through the street after another, until she is dead."
"It is you," said the aged king, "and you have pronounced your own sentence, and thus it shall be done unto you." And when the sentence had been carried out, the young king married his true bride, and both of them reigned over their kingdom in peace and happiness. The Young Giant. Once upon a time, a countryman had a son who was as big as a thumb, and did not become any bigger, and during several years did not grow 1 hair's breadth. Once when the father was going out to plow, the little one said,
"Father, I will go out with you."
"You would go out with me?" said the father. "Stay here. You will be of no use out there. Besides, you might get lost." And then Thumbling began to cry, and for the sake of peace his father put him in his pocket and took him out with him. When he was outside in the field, he took him out again and set him in a freshly cut furrow. Whilst he sat there, a great giant came over the hill. "Do you see that great bogey?" said the father, for he wanted to frighten the little fellow to make him behave well. "He's coming to fetch you." The giant, however, had scarcely taken 2 steps with his long legs before he was in the furrow. He took up little Thumbling carefully with 2 fingers, examined him, and without saying one word, went away with him. Thumbling's father stood by, but could not utter a sound for terror, and he thought nothing else but that his child was lost, and that as long as he lived he should never set eyes on him again. The giant carried him home, let him suckle at his breast, and Thumbling grew and became tall and strong after the manner of giants. When 2 years had passed, the old giant took him into the forest, wanted to test him, and said,
"Pull up a stick for yourself."
Then the boy was already so strong that he tore up a young tree out of the earth by the roots. But the giant thought, "We must do better than that," took him back again, and suckled him 2 years longer. When he tested him, his strength had increased so much that he could tear an old tree out of the ground. That was still not enough for the giant. He again suckled him for 2 more years, and when he then went with him into the forest and said,
"Now, just tear up a real stick."
the boy tore up the biggest oak tree from the earth, so that it cracked, and that was a mere trifle to him.
"Now that will do," said the giant. "You are perfect."
And he took him back to the field from whence he'd brought him. His father was there, following the plow. The young giant went up to him and said,
"Does my father see what a fine man his son has grown into?"
The farmer was alarmed and said, "No, you are not my son. I don't want you. Leave me."
"Truly I am your son. Allow me to do your work. I can plow as well as you, nay, better than you."
No, you are not my son, and you cannot plow. Go away." However, as he was afraid of this great man, he let go of the plow, stepped back and sat down at the side of the land. Then the youth took the plow and just grasped it with one hand, but his pressure was so strong that the plow went through deep into the earth. The farmer could not bear to see that, and he called to him, "If you are determined to plow, you must not press so hard on it. That makes bad work." The youth, however, unharnessed the horses and drew the plow himself, saying,
"Just go home, father, and bid my mother make ready a large dish of food, and in the meantime I will go over the field."
Then the farmer went home and ordered his wife to prepare the food. But the youth plowed the field, which was 2 acres large, quite alone, and then he harnessed himself to the harrow, and harrowed the whole of the land, using 2 harrows at once. When he had done it, he went into the forest and pulled up 2 oak trees, laid them across his shoulders, and hung on them 1 harrow behind and 1 before, and also 1 horse behind and 1 before, and carried all as if it had been a bundle of straw back to his parents' house. When he entered the yard, his mother did not recognize him, and asked,
"Who is that horrible tall man?"
The father said, "That is our son." She said,
"No, that cannot be our son. We never had such a tall one. Ours was just a little thing."
She called to him,
"Go away! We do not want you."
The youth was silent, but he led his horses to the stable, gave them some oats and hay, and all that they wanted. When he had done this, he went into the parlor, sat down on a bench, and said,
"Mother, now I should like something to eat. Will it soon be ready?"
She said, "Yes," and brought in 2 immense dishes full of food, which would have been enough to satisfy herself and her husband for a week. The youth, however, ate the whole of it himself, and asked if she had nothing more to set before him.
"No," she replied, "that is all we have."
"But that was only a taste. I must have more."
She did not dare to oppose him, and went and put a huge pig's trough full of food on the fire, and when it was ready, she carried it in.
"At length come a few crumbs,"
said he, and he gobbled all there was, but it was still not sufficient to appease his hunger. Then said he,
"Father, I see well that with you I shall never have enough food. If you will get me an iron staff which is strong, and which I cannot break against my knee, I will go out into the world."
The farmer was glad. He put his 2 horses in his cart, and fetched from the smith a staff so large and thick that the 2 horses could only just bring it away. The youth laid it across his knee. Snap! He broke it in 2 in the middle like a beanstalk, and he threw it away. The father then harnessed 4 horses, and brought a bar which was so long and thick that the 4 horses could only just drag it. The son snapped this also in twain against his knees, threw it away, and said, "Father, this can be of no use to me. You must harness more horses and bring a stronger staff." So the father harnessed 8 horses, and brought one which was so long and thick that the 8 horses could only just carry it. When the son took it in his hand, he immediately snapped off the end of it, and he said,
"Father, I see that you will not be able to procure me any such staff as I want. I will remain no longer with you."
So he went away and gave out that he was a smith's apprentice. He arrived at a village wherein lived a smith who was a stingy fellow, who never did a kindness to anyone, but wanted everything for himself. The youth went into the smithy and asked if he needed a journeyman. "Yeah," said the smith, and he looked at him and thought, "That is a strong fellow who will strike out well and earn his bread." So he asked, "How much wages do you want?"
"I don't want any at all," he replied. "Only every fortnight, when the other journeymen are paid, I will give you 2 blows, and you must bear them."
The miser was heartily satisfied by this, and thought he would thus save so much money. The next morning the strange journeyman was to begin to work, but when the master brought the glowing bar, and the youth struck his first blow, the iron flew asunder, and the anvil sank so deep into the earth that there was no bringing it out again. Then the miser grew angry and said,
"Ah, but I can't make any use of you. You strike far too powerfully. How much will you have for the 1 blow?"
Then said he,
"I will only give you quite a small blow, that's all."
and he raised his foot, and he gave him such a kick that he flew away over 4 loads of hay. Then he sought out the thickest iron bar in the smithy for himself, took it as a stick in his hand, and went onwards. When he had walked for some time, he came to a small farm and asked the bailiff if he did not require a headman.
"Yeah," said the bailiff, "I can make use of one. You look like a capable fellow who can do something. How much a year do you want as wages?"
He again replied that he wanted no wages at all, but that every year he would give him 3 blows, which he must bear. Then the bailiff was satisfied, for he too was a covetous fellow. The next morning all the servants were to go into the wood, and the others were already up, but the head man was still in bed. Then one of them called to get him up.
"It is time. We are going into the wood. You must go with us."
"Ah,"
said he, quite roughly and surlily.
"You may just go then. I shall be back again before any of you."
Then the others went to the bailiff and told him that the head man was still lying in bed and would not go into the wood with them. The bailiff said that they were to awaken him again and tell him to harness the horses. The head man, however, said as before,
"Just go there. I shall be back again before any of you."
And then he stayed in bed 2 hours longer. At length he arose from the feathers, but first he got himself 2 bushels of peas from the loft, made himself some broth, ate it at his leisure, and when that was done, went and harnessed the horses and drove into the wood. Not far from the wood was a ravine through which he had to pass, so he first drove the horses on, and then stopped them and went behind the cart, took trees and brushwood, and made a great barricade, so that no horse could get through. When he was entering the wood, the others were just driving out of it with their loaded carts to go home. Then said he to them,
"Drive on. I will still get home before you do."
He didn't drive very far into the wood, but at once tore 2 of the very largest trees of all out of the earth, threw them on his cart, and turned around. When he came to the barricade, the others were still standing there, not able to get through.
"Don't you see," said he, "that if you had stayed with me, you would have gotten home just as quickly, and would have had another hour's sleep?"
He now wanted to drive on, but his horses could not work their way through, so he unharnessed them, laid them on top of the cart, took the shafts in his own hands, and pulled it all through, and he did this just as easily if it had been laden with feathers. When he was over, he said to the others, "There, you see, I've got over quicker than you." He drove on, and the others had to stay where they were. In the yard, however, he took a tree in his hand, showed it to the bailiff, and said, "Isn't that a fine cord of wood?" Then said the bailiff to his wife, "The servant is a good one. Even if he does sleep long, he is still home before the others." So he served the bailiff for a year, and when that was over, and the other servants were getting their wages, he said it was time for him to take his too. The bailiff, however, was afraid of the blows which he was to receive, and earnestly entreated him to excuse him from having them, for rather than that, he himself would be a headman, and the youth shall be bailiff.
"No," said he, "I will not be bailiff. I am headman, and will remain so, but I will administer that which we agreed on."
The bailiff was willing to give him whatsoever he demanded, but it was of no use, as the headman had said no to everything. Then the bailiff did not know what to do, and begged for a fortnight's delay, for he wanted to find some way of escape. The headman consented to this delay. The bailiff summoned all of his clerks together, and they were to think the matter over, and give him advice. The clerks pondered for a long time, but at last they said that no one was sure of his life with the headman, for he could not kill a man as easily as a midge, and that the bailiff ought to make him get into the well and clean it, and when he was down below, they would roll up one of the millstones which was lying there, and throw it on his head, and then he would never return to daylight. The advice pleased the bailiff, and the headman was quite willing to go down into the well. When he was standing down below at the bottom, they rolled down the largest millstone and thought that they had broken his skull, but he cried,
"Chase away those hens from the well. They're scratching in the sand up there and throwing the grains into my eyes so that I cannot see."
So the bailiff cried, "Shoo, shoo, 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 shoo," and he pretended to frighten the hens away. When the headman had finished his work, he climbed up and said,
"Just look at what a beautiful necktie I have on."
And behold, it was the millstone which he was wearing around his neck. The headman now wanted to take his reward, but the bailiff again begged for a fortnight's delay. The clerks met together and advised him to send the headman to the haunted mill to grind corn by night, for from whence as yet no man had ever returned in the morning alive. The proposal pleased the bailiff. He called the headman that very evening and ordered him to take 8 bushels of corn to the mill and grind it that night, for it was wanted. So the headman went to the loft and put 2 bushels in his right pocket and 2 in his left, and took 4 in a wallet, half on his back and half on his breast, and thus laden went to the haunted mill. The miller told him that he could grind there very well by day, but not by night, for the mill was haunted, and that up to the present time whosoever had gone into it at night had been found in the morning lying dead inside. He said,
"I will manage it. Just you go and put your head on the pillow."
Then he went into the mill and poured out the corn. About 11 o'clock he went into the miller's room and sat down on the bench. When he had sat there a while, a door suddenly opened, and a large table came in, and on the table wine and roasted meats placed themselves, and much good food besides, but everything came of itself, for no one was there to carry it. After this the chairs pushed themselves up, but no people came, until all at once he beheld fingers which handled knives and forks, and laid food upon the plates, but with this exception he saw nothing. As he was hungry, and he had seen the food, he too placed himself at the table, ate with those who were eating, and enjoyed it. When he had had enough, and all the others had quite emptied their dishes, he distinctly heard all the candles being suddenly snuffed out, and as it was now pitch dark, he felt something like a box on the ear. Then he said,
"If anything of that kind comes again, I shall strike out and return."
And when he had received the second box on the ear, he too struck out. And so it continued the whole night. He took nothing without returning it, but repaid everything with interest, and did not slay about him in vain. At daybreak, however, everything ceased. When the miller had to get up, he wanted to look after him, and wondered if he were still alive. Then the youth said,
"I have given some in return."
The miller rejoiced and said that the mill was now released from the spell, and wanted to give him much money as a reward. But he said,
"Money I will not have. I have enough of it."
So he took his meal on his back, went home, and told the bailiff that he had done what he had been told to do, and that he would now have the reward that they had agreed upon. When the bailiff heard that, he was seriously alarmed and quite beside himself. He walked to and fro in the room, and drops of sweat ran down from his forehead. Then he opened the window to get some fresh air, but before he was aware, the head man had given him such a kick that he flew through the window out into the air, and so far away that no one ever saw him again. Then said the head man to the bailiff's wife,
"If he does not come back, you must take the other blow."
She cried,
No, I cannot bear it.
and he opened the other window, because drops of sweat were running down her forehead. Then he gave her such a kick that she too flew out, and as she was lighter, she went much higher than her husband. Her husband cried,
"Do come to me."
but she replied,
Come you to me, I cannot come to you.
and they hovered about there in the air, and could not get to each other. And whether they are still hovering about or not, I do not know. But the young giant took up his iron bar, and he went again on his way. The Gnome. There was once upon a time a rich king who had 3 daughters, who daily went to walk in the palace garden, and the king was a great lover of all kinds of fine trees. But there was one for which he had such an affection, that if anyone gathered an apple from it, he wished him 100 fathoms underground. And when harvest time came, the apples on his tree were all as red as blood. The 3 daughters went every day beneath the tree, and looked to see if the wind had not blown down an apple, but they never by any chance found one. And the tree was so loaded with them that it was almost breaking, and the branches hung down to the ground. And then the king's youngest child had a great desire for an apple, and said to her sisters,
"Our father loves us far too much to wish us underground. It is my belief that he would only do that to people who were strangers."
And while she was speaking, the child plucked off quite a large apple, and ran to her sisters, saying,
"Just taste, my dear little sisters, just taste it, for never in my life have I tasted anything so delightful."
Then the 2 other sisters also ate some of the apple, whereupon all 3 sank deep down into the earth, where they could hear no cock crow. When midday came, the king wished to call them to come to dinner, but they were nowhere to be found. He sought them everywhere in the palace and the garden, but could not find them. Then he was much troubled, and made known to the whole land that whosoever brought his daughters back again should have one of them to wife. Hereupon, so many young men went out about in the country to search, that there was no counting them, for everyone loved the 3 children, because they were so kind to all, and so fair of face. 3 young huntsmen also went out, and when they had traveled about for 8 days, they arrived at a great castle, in which were beautiful apartments, and in one room a table was laid, on which were delicate dishes which were still so warm that they were smoking. But in the whole of the castle no human being was either to be seen or heard. They waited there for half of a day, and the food still remained warm and smoking, and at length they were so hungry that they sat down to eat, and agreed with each other that they would stay and live in that castle, and that one of them, who should be chosen by casting lots, should remain in the house, and the 2 others seek the king's daughters. They cast lots, and the lot fell on the eldest. So the next day the 2 younger went out to seek, and the eldest had to stay home. At midday came a small mannikin and begged for a piece of bread. The huntsman took the bread which he had found there, and cut a round off of the loaf, and was about to give it to him. But while he was giving it to the mannikin, the latter let it fall, and asked the huntsman to be so good as to give him that piece again. The huntsman was about to do so, and stooped, on which the mannikin took a stick, seized him by the hair, and gave him a good beating. On the next day the second stayed home, and he fared no better. When the 2 others returned in the evening, the eldest said, "Well, how have you got on?" "Oh, very badly," said he, and then they lamented their misfortune together. But they said nothing about it to the youngest. They did not like him at all, and always called him Stupid Hans, because he did not know any of the ways of the world. On the 3rd day the youngest stayed home, and again the little mannikin came and begged for a piece of bread. When the youth gave it to him, the gnome let it fall just as before, and he asked him to be so good as to give him that piece again. Then said Hans to the little mannikin, "What? Can you not pick up that piece yourself? If you will not take as much trouble as that for your daily bread, then you do not deserve to have it." Then the mannikin grew very angry and demanded that he was to do it, but the huntsman would not, and took the dear mannikin and gave him a thorough beating. Then the mannikin screamed terribly and cried,
"Stop, stop! Let me go, and I will tell you where the king's daughters are."
When Hans heard that, he left off beating him, and the mannikin told him that he was a gnome, and that there were more than 1,000 like him, and that if he would go with him, he would show him where the king's daughters were. And then he showed him a deep well, but there was no water in it. And the gnome said that he knew well that the companions Hans had with him did not intend to deal honorably with him. Therefore, if he wished to deliver the king's children, he must do it alone. The 2 other brothers would also be very glad to recover the king's daughters, but they did not want to have any trouble or danger. Hans was therefore to take a large basket, and he must seat himself in it with his hunting knife and a bell, and be let down the well.
Below are 3 rooms, and in each of them was a princess, who was lousing a dragon with many heads, which he must cut off.
And having said all of this, the gnome vanished. When it was evening, the 2 brothers came and asked how he had gotten on, and he said, "Pretty well so far," and that he had seen no one, except at midday, when a little mannikin had come and begged for a piece of bread, that he had given some to him, but that the mannikin had let it fall, and he had asked him to pick it up again. But as he did not choose to do that, the gnome had begun to scold, and that he had lost his temper,
and had given the gnome a beating, at which he had told him where the king's daughters were. Then the two brothers were so angry at this that they grew green and yellow. Next morning they went to the well together, and drew lots who should first seat himself in the basket. And again the lot fell on the eldest, and he was to seat himself in it and take the bell with him. Then he said, "If I ring, you must draw me up again immediately." When he had gone down for a short distance, he rang, and they at once drew him up again. Then the second seated himself in the basket, but he did just the same as the first. And then it was the turn of the youngest, but he let himself be lowered quite to the bottom. When he had gotten out of the basket, he took his knife and went and stood outside the first door and listened, and he heard the dragon snoring quite loudly. He opened the door slowly, and one of the princesses was sitting there, and had 9 dragons' heads lying upon her lap, and was lousing them. Then he took his knife and hewed at them, and the 9 fell off. The princess sprang up, threw her arms around his neck, embraced and kissed him repeatedly, and took her stomacher, which was made of pure gold, and hung it around his neck. Then he went to the second princess, who had a dragon with 5 heads to louse, and delivered her also, and to the youngest, who had a dragon with 4 heads, he went likewise. And they all rejoiced, and embraced him and kissed him without stopping. Then he rang very loud, so that those above heard him, and he placed the princesses one after another into the basket, and had them all drawn up. But when it came to his turn, he remembered the words of the gnome, who had told him that his comrades did not mean well by him. At this he took a great stone which was lying there, and placed it in the basket, and when it was about halfway up, his false brothers above cut the rope, so that the basket with the stone fell to the ground, and they thought that he was dead. And they ran away with the 3 princesses, making them promise to tell their father that it was they who had delivered them. Then they went to the king, and each demanded a princess in marriage. In the meantime, the youngest huntsman was wandering about the 3 chambers in great trouble, fully expecting to have to end his days there, when he saw hanging on the wall a flute. Then said he, "Why do you hang there? No one can be merry here." He looked at the dragons' heads likewise, and said, "You too cannot help me now." He walked to and fro for such a long time that he made the surface of the ground quite smooth. But at last other thoughts came to his mind, and he took the flute from the wall, and played a few notes on it, and suddenly a number of gnomes appeared, and with every note that he sounded, one more came out. Then he played until the room was entirely filled. They all asked him what he had desired, so he said he wished to get above ground, back to daylight, on which they seized him by every hair that grew on his head, and thus they flew with him onto the earth again. When he was above ground, he at once went to the king's palace, just as the wedding of one of the princesses was about to be celebrated, and he went to the room where the king and his 3 daughters were. When the princesses saw him, they fainted. Hereupon the king was angry, and ordered him to be put in prison at once, because he thought he must have done some injury to his children. When the princesses came to themselves, however, they entreated the king to set him free again. The king asked why, and they said that they were not allowed to tell that, but their father said they were to tell it to the stove. And he went out, listened at the door, and he heard everything they said. Then he caused the 2 brothers to be hanged on the gallows, and to the 3rd he gave his youngest daughter. And on that occasion I wore a pair of glass shoes, and I struck them against the stone, and they said, "Clink," and they were broken.
The King of the Golden Mountain. There was a certain merchant who had 2 children, a boy and a girl. They were both young and could not walk. And 2 richly laden ships of his sailed forth to sea with all of his property on board, and just as he was expecting to win much money by them, news came that they had gone to the bottom, and now, instead of being a rich man, he was a poor one, and had nothing left but one field outside of the town. In order to drive his misfortune a little out of his thoughts, he went out to this field, and as he was walking to and fro in it, a little black mannikin stood suddenly by his side, and asked why he was so sad, and what he was taking so much to heart. Then said the merchant, "If you could help me, I would willingly tell you."
"Who knows?" replied the black dwarf. "Perhaps I can help you."
Then the merchant told him that all that he had possessed had gone to the bottom of the sea, and that he had nothing left but this field.
"Do not trouble yourself," said the dwarf. "If you will promise to give me the first thing that rubs itself against your leg when you are at home again, and to bring it here to this place in 12 years' time, you shall have as much money as you will."
The merchant thought, what can that be but my dog? He didn't remember his little boy, so he said, yes. He gave the black man a written and sealed promise, and went home. When he reached home, his little boy was so delighted that he held himself by a bench, trotted up to him, and seized him fast by the legs. The father was shocked, for he remembered his promise, and now knew what he had pledged himself to do. However, he still found no money in his chest. He thought the dwarf had only been jesting. A month afterwards, he went up to the garret, intending to gather together some old tin and sell it, and saw lying there a great heap of money. Then he was happy again. He made purchases, became a greater merchant than before, and felt that God was good to him. In the meantime, the boy grew tall, and at the same time bright and clever. But the nearer the 12th year approached, the more anxious grew the merchant, so that his distress might be seen in his face. One day his son asked what ailed him, but the father would not say. The boy, however, persisted so long that at last he told him that without being aware of what he was doing, he had promised him to a black dwarf, and had received much money for doing so. He said likewise that he had set his hand and his seal to this, and that now, when 12 years had gone by, he would have to give him up. Then said the son,
"Oh, father, don't be so uneasy. All will go well. The black mannequin has no power over me."
The son had himself blessed by the priest, and when the time came, father and son went together to the field, and the son made a circle and placed himself in sight of it with his father. Then came the black dwarf and said to the old man,
"Have you brought with you that which you have promised me?"
He was silent, but the son asked, "What do you want here?" Then said the black dwarf,
"I have to speak with your father, and not with you."
The son replied, "You have betrayed and misled my father. Give back the writing."
"No,"
said the black dwarf.
"I will not give up my rights."
They spoke together for a long time after this, but at last they agreed that the son, as he did not belong to the enemy of mankind, nor yet to his father, should seat himself in a small boat, which should lie on water which was flowing away from them, and that the father should push it off with his own foot, and then the son should remain given to the water. So he took leave of his father, placed himself in the little boat, and the father had to push it off with his own foot. The boat capsized so that the keel was uppermost and the deck underwater, and the father believed his son was lost, and went home and mourned for him. The boat, however, did not sink, but floated quietly away, and the boy sat safely inside of it, and it floated thus for a long time, until at last it ran into an unknown shore. Then he landed and he saw a beautiful castle before him, and set out to go to it. But when he entered it, he found that it was bewitched. He went through every room, but all were empty, until he reached the last, where a snake lay coiled in a ring. The snake, however, was an enchanted maiden, who rejoiced to see him, and said,
"Have you come, oh my deliverer? I have already waited 12 years for you. This kingdom is bewitched, and you must set it free."
"How can I do that?" he inquired.
"Tonight come 12 black mannequin, covered with chains, who will ask what you are doing here, but be silent. Give them no answer, and let them do what they will with you. They will torment you, beat you, stab you. Just let everything pass. Only do not speak. At 12 o'clock, they must go away again. On the second night, 12 others will come. On the third, 24, who will cut off your head. But at 12 o'clock, their power will be over, and then, if you have endured all, and have not spoken the slightest word, I shall be released. I will come to you, and I will have in a bottle some of the water of life. I will rub you with that, and then you will come to life again and be just as healthy as before."
Then said he, "I will gladly set you free." And everything happened just as she had said. The black mannequin could not force a single word from him, and on the third night, the snake became a beautiful princess who came with the water of life and brought him back to life again. So she threw herself into his arms and kissed him, and there was joy and gladness in the whole castle. After this, their marriage was celebrated, and he was the king of the Golden Mountain. They lived very happily together, and the queen bore a fine boy. 8 years had already gone by when the king bethought him of his father. His heart was moved, and he wished to visit him. The queen, however, would not let him go away and said,
"I know beforehand that it will cause my unhappiness."
But he suffered her to have no rest until she consented. At their parting, she gave him a wishing ring and said,
"Take this ring and put it on your finger, and then you will immediately be transported whithersoever you would be. Only you must promise me not to use it in wishing me away from this place and with thy father."
That he promised her, put the ring on his finger, and wished himself at home, just outside the town where his father lived. Instantly he found himself there, and he made for the town. But when he came to the gate, the sentries would not let him in, because he wore such strange and yet such rich and magnificent clothing. Then he went to a hill where a shepherd was watching his sheep. He changed clothes with the shepherd, put on his old shepherd's coat, and then entered the town without any hindrance. When he came to his father, he made himself known to him, but he did not at all believe that the shepherd was his son, and he said he certainly had had a son, but that he was dead long ago. However, as he saw he was a poor, needy shepherd, he would give him something to eat. Then the shepherd said to his parents, "I am verily your son. Do you know of no mark on my body by which you could recognize me?"
"Yes," said his mother. "Our son had a raspberry mark under his right arm."
The boy slipped back his shirt, and they saw the raspberry under his right arm, and no longer doubted that he was their son. Then he told them that he was the king of the Golden Mountain, and a king's daughter was his wife, and that they had a fine son of 7 years old. Then said the father, "That is certainly not true. It is a fine kind of a king who goes about in a ragged shepherd's coat." On this, the son fell in a passion, and without thinking of his promise, he turned his ring around and wished both his wife and his child to be with him so he could prove this to his parents. They were there in a second, but the queen wept and reproached him, and said that he had broken his word and had brought misfortune upon her. He said, "I have done it thoughtlessly and not with evil intention," and he tried to calm her, and she pretended to believe this, but she had mischief in her mind. Then he led her out of the town into the field, and showed her the stream where the little boat had been pushed off, and then he said, "I am tired. Sit down. I will sleep a while on your lap." He laid his head on her lap, and she picked his lice for a while until he fell asleep. When he was asleep, she first drew the ring from his finger, then she drew away the foot which was under him, leaving only the slipper behind her, and she took her child into her arms, and wished herself back into her own kingdom. When he awoke, there he lay quite deserted, and his wife and child were gone, and so was the ring from his finger. The slipper only was still there as a token. "Home to your parents you cannot return," thought he. "They would say that you are a wizard. You must be off, and walk on until you arrive in your own kingdom." So he went away and came at length to a hill by which 3 giants were standing, disputing with each other because they did not know how to divide their father's property. When they saw him passing by, they called to him and said, little men had quick wits, and that he was to divide their inheritance for them. The inheritance, however, consisted of a sword which, if anyone took it in his hand and said, "All heads off but mine," every head would lie on the ground. Secondly, of a cloak which made anyone who put it on invisible. Thirdly, of a pair of boots which could transport the wearer to any place he wished in just a moment. He said, "Give me the 3 things that I may see if they are still in good condition." They gave him the cloak, and when he had put it on he was invisible and changed into a fly. Then he resumed his own form and said, "The cloak is a good one, now give me the sword." They said, "No, we will not give you that. If you were to say, 'All heads off but mine,' all of our heads would be off, and you alone would be left with yours. Nevertheless, they gave it to him on the condition that he was only to try it against a tree. This he did, and the sword cut in two the trunk of a tree as if it had been a blade of straw. Then he wanted to have the boots likewise, but they said, "No, we will not give them. If you had them on your feet and were to wish yourself at the top of the hill, we should be left down here with nothing." "Oh no," said he, "I will not do that." So they gave him the boots as well. And now, when he had gotten all of these things, he thought of nothing but his wife and his child, and said as though to himself, "Oh, if I were but on the golden mountain." And at that same moment he vanished from the sight of the giants, and thus their inheritance was divided. When he was near his palace, he heard sounds of joy, and fiddles, and flutes, and the people told him that his wife was celebrating her wedding with another. Then he fell into a rage and said, "False woman, she betrayed and deserted me whilst I was asleep." So he put on his cloak, and unseen by all, went into the palace. When he entered the dining hall, a great table was spread with delicious food, and the guests were eating and drinking, and laughing and jesting. She sat on a royal seat in the midst of them in splendid apparel, with a crown upon her head. He placed himself behind her, and no one saw him. When she put a piece of meat on a plate for herself, he took it away and ate it, and when she poured out a glass of wine for herself, he took it away and drank it. She was always helping herself to something, and yet she never got anything, for plate and glass disappeared immediately. Then, dismayed and ashamed, she arose and went to her chamber and wept, but he followed her there as well. She said,
"Has the devil power over me, or did my deliverer never come?"
Then he struck her in the face and said, "Did your deliverer never come? Is it he who has you in his power, you traitor? Have I deserved this from you?" Then he made himself visible, went into the hall and cried, "The wedding is at an end! The true king has returned!" The kings, princes, and counselors who were assembled there ridiculed and mocked him, but he did not trouble to answer them and said, "Will you go away or not?" On this they tried to seize him and pressed upon him, but he drew his sword and said, "All heads off but mine!" And all the heads rolled on the ground, and he alone was master, and once more he was the king of the Golden Mountain. The Raven. There was once upon a time a queen who had a little daughter who was still so young that she had to be carried. One day the child was naughty, and the mother might say what she liked, but the child would not be quiet. Then she became impatient, and as the ravens were flying about the palace, she opened the window and said, "I wish you were a raven and would fly away, and then I should have some rest." Scarcely had she spoken the words before the child was changed into a raven and flew from her arms out of the window. It flew into a dark forest and stayed in it a long time, and the parents heard nothing of their child. Then one day a man was on his way through the forest and heard a raven crying, and followed the voice, and when he came nearer, the bird said,
"I am the king's daughter by birth. I am bewitched, but you can set me free."
"What am I to do?" asked he. She said,
"Go further into the forest, and you will find a house wherein sits an aged woman who will offer you meat and drink, but you must accept nothing, for if you eat and drink anything, you will fall into a sleep, and then you will not be able to set me free. In the garden behind the house there is a great heap of tan, and on this you shall stand and wait for me. For 3 days I will come every afternoon at 2 o'clock in the carriage. On the first day, 4 white horses will be harnessed to it, then 4 chestnut horses, then lastly 4 black ones. But if you are not awake, but sleeping, I shall not be set free."
The man promised to do everything that she desired, but the raven said,
"Alas, I know already that you will not set me free. You will accept something from the woman."
Then the man once more promised that he would certainly not touch anything either to eat or drink. But when he entered the house, the old woman came to him and said,
"Oh, man, how faint you are. Come and refresh yourself. Eat and drink."
"No," said the man, "I will not eat or drink." She, however, let him have no peace and said,
"If you will not eat, take one drink out of the glass. One is nothing."
Then he let himself be persuaded, and he drank. Shortly before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he went into the garden to the tan heap to wait for the raven. As he was standing there, his weariness all at once became so great that he could not struggle against it, and he lay down for a short time, but he was determined not to go to sleep. Hardly, however, had he lain down, than his eyes closed of their own accord, and he fell asleep and slept so soundly that nothing in the world could have aroused him. At 2 o'clock the raven came driving up with 4 white horses, but she was already in deep grief and said,
"I know he is asleep."
And when she came into the garden, he was indeed lying there asleep on the heap of tan. She alighted from the carriage, went to him, shook him, and called him, but he did not awake. The next day about noon, the old woman came again, brought him food and drink, but he would not take any of it. She let him have no rest, and persuaded him until at length he again took one drink out of the glass. Towards 2 o'clock he went into the garden to the tan heap to wait for the raven, but all at once he felt such a great weariness that his limbs would no longer support him. He could not help himself, and he was forced to lie down, and fell into a heavy sleep. When the raven drove up with 4 brown horses, she was already full of grief, and said,
"I know he is asleep."
She went to him, but there he lay sleeping, and there was no wakening him. The next day the old woman asked what was the meaning of this. He was neither eating nor drinking anything. Did he want to die? He replied, "I am not allowed to eat or drink, and will not do so." But she set a dish with food and a glass with wine before him, and when he smelt it, he could not resist, and he swallowed a deep draught. When the time came, he went out into the garden to the heap of tan, and he waited for the king's daughter, but he became still more weary than on the day before, and lay down and slept as soundly as if he had been a stone. At 2 o'clock the raven came with 4 black horses, and the coachman and everything else was black. She was already in the deepest grief, and said,
"I know that he is asleep, and cannot set me free."
And she came to him. There he was, lying fast asleep. She shook him and she called him, but she could not waken him. Then she laid a loaf beside him, and after that a piece of meat, and thirdly a bottle of wine, and he might consume as much of all of them as he liked, but they would never grow less. After this, she took a gold ring from her finger and put it on his, and her name was graven on it. Lastly, she laid a letter beside him wherein was written what she had given him, and that none of the things would ever grow less. And in it was also written, "I see right well that here you will never be able to set me free, but if you are still willing to do so, come to the golden castle of Stromberg. It lies in your power, of that I am certain." And when she had given him all these things, she seated herself in her carriage, and drove to the golden castle of Stromberg. When the man awoke and saw that he had slept, he was sad at heart, and said, "She has certainly driven by, and I have not set her free." Then he perceived the things which were lying beside him, and read the letter wherein was written how everything had happened. So he arose and went away, intending to go to the golden castle of Stromberg, but he did not know where it was. After he had walked about the world for a long time, he entered into a dark forest, and walked on for 14 days, and still could not find his way out. Then it was once more evening, and he was so tired that he lay down in a thicket and fell asleep. On the next day he went onwards, and in the evening, as he was again about to lie down beneath some bushes, he heard such a howling and crying that he could not go to sleep. And at the time when people light the candles, he saw one glimmering, and arose and went towards it. Then he came to a house which seemed very small, for in front of it a great giant was standing. He thought to himself, "If I go in and the giant sees me, it will very likely cost me my life." At length he ventured it and went in. When the giant saw him, he said,
"It is well that you come, for it is long since I have eaten. I will at once devour you for my supper."
"Well, I'd rather you did not," said the man. "I do not like to be eaten, but if you have any desire to eat, I have quite enough here to satisfy you."
"If that be true," said the giant, "you may be easy. I was only going to devour you because I had nothing else."
Then they went and sat down to the table, and the man took out the bread, the wine, and the meat, which would never come to an end.
"This pleases me well,"
said the giant, and he ate to his heart's content. Then the man said to him, "Can you tell me where the golden castle of Stromberg is?" The giant said,
"I will look at my map. All the towns and the villages and houses are to be found on it."
He brought out the map which he had in the room and looked for the castle, but it was not to be found on it.
"It's no matter," said he. "I have some still larger maps in my cupboard upstairs, and we will look at them."
But there too it was in vain. The man now wanted to set out again, but the giant begged him to wait a few days longer until his brother, who had gone out to bring some provisions, came home. When the brother came home, they inquired about the golden castle of Stromberg. He replied,
"When I have eaten and have had enough, I will look at the map."
Then he went with them to his chamber, and they searched on his map, but they could not find it either. Then he brought out still older maps, and they never rested until they found the golden castle of Stromberg, but it was many thousands of miles away. "Well, how am I to get there?" asked the man. The giant said,
"I have 2 hours' time, during which I will carry you into the neighborhood, but after that I must be home to suckle the child that we have."
So the giant carried the man to about 100 leagues from the castle and said,
"You can very well walk the rest of the way alone."
And he turned back, but the man went onwards day and night until at length he came to the golden castle of Stromberg. It stood on a glass mountain, and the bewitched maiden was driving in her carriage round the castle, and then went inside it. He rejoiced when he saw her, and he wanted to climb up to her, but when he began to do so, he always slipped down the glass again, and when he saw that he could not reach her, he was very worried and said to himself, "I will stay down here below and wait for her." So he built himself a hut, and he stayed in it for a whole year, and every day he saw the king's daughter driving about above, but he never could reach her. Then one day he saw from his hut 3 robbers who were beating each other, and he cried to them, "God be with you." They stopped when they heard the cry, but as they saw no one, they once more began to beat each other, and that too most dangerously. So he again cried, "God be with you." Again they stopped, they looked around, but as they saw no one, they went on beating each other. Then he cried for the 3rd time, "God be with you." And he thought, "I must see what these 3 are about." And he went thither and asked why they were beating each other so furiously. One of them said that he had found a stick, and that when he struck a door with it, that door would spring open. The next said that he had found a mantle, and whenever he put it on, he was invisible. But the 3rd said that he had found a horse on which a man could ride everywhere, even up a glass mountain. And now they did not know whether they ought to have these things in common, or whether they ought to divide them. Then the man said, "I will give you something in exchange for these 3 things. Money indeed have I not, but I have other things of more value. But first I must make an experiment to see if you have told the truth." Then they put him on the horse, threw the mantle around him, and gave him the stick in his hand. And when he had all of these things, they were no longer able to see him. So he gave them some vigorous blows and cried, "Now, vagabonds, you have got what you deserve. Are you satisfied?" And he rode up the glass mountain, but when he came in front of the castle at the top, it was shut. He then struck the door with his stick, and it sprang open immediately. He went in and ascended the stairs until he came to a hall where the maiden was sitting with a golden goblet of wine before her. She, however, could not see him because he had the mantle on. When he came up to her, he drew from his finger the ring which she had given him, threw it into the goblet so that it rang. Then she cried, "That is my ring! So the man who is to set me free must be here." They searched the whole castle and did not find him, but he had gone out, and he had seated himself on the horse and thrown off the mantle. When they came to the door, they saw him and cried aloud in their delight. Then he alighted and took the king's daughter in his arms, but she kissed him and said, "Now you have set me free, and tomorrow we will celebrate our wedding." The 3 Little Birds. About 1,000 or more years ago, there were in this country nothing but small kings, and one of them, who lived on the Keutenberg, was very fond of hunting. Once on a time, when he was riding forth from his castle with his huntsmen, 3 girls were watching their cows upon the mountain, and when they saw the king with all of his followers, the eldest girl pointed to him and called to the other girls, "Hello, hello! If I do not get that one, I will have none." Then the second girl answered from the other side of the hill, and pointed to the one who was on the king's right hand, "Hello, hello! If I do not get him, I will have no one." These, however, were the 2 ministers. The king heard all of this, and when he had come from the back of the chase, he caused the 3 girls to be brought to him, and asked him what they had said yesterday on the mountain. This they would not tell him, so the king asked the eldest if she really would take him for her husband. Then she said yes, and the 2 ministers married the 2 sisters, for they were all 3 fair and beautiful of face, especially the queen, who had hair like flax. But the 2 sisters had no children, and once the king was obliged to go from home, he invited them to come to the queen in order to cheer her, for she was about to bear a child. She had had a little boy who brought a bright red star into the world with him. Then the 2 sisters said to each other that they would throw the beautiful boy into the water. When they had thrown him in, I believe it was into the Weser, a little bird flew up into the air which sang,
To thy death art thou sped, until God's word be said. In the white lily bloom, brave boy is thy tomb.
When the 2 heard that, they were frightened to death, and ran away in great haste. When the king came home, they told him that the queen had been delivered of a dog. Then the king said, "What God does is well done." But a fisherman who dwelt near the water fished the little boy out again while he was still alive, and as his wife had no children, they reared the boy. When a year had gone by, the king again went away, and the queen had another little boy, whom the false sisters likewise took and threw into the water. Then again up flew a little bird and sang,
To thy death art thou speed, until God's word be said. In a white lily bloom, brave boy is thy tomb.
And when the king came back, they told him that the queen had once more given birth to a dog, and he again said, "What God does is well done." The fisherman, however, fished this one also out of the water, and reared him. Then the king again journeyed forth, and the queen had a little girl, whom also the false sisters threw into the water. Then again a little bird flew up on high and sang,
To thy death art thou sped, until God's word be said. In the white lily bloom, bonny girl is thy tomb.
And when the king came home, they told him that the queen had been delivered of a cat. Then the king grew angry, and ordered his wife to be cast into prison, and therein was she shut up for many long years. When the children had grown up, the eldest once went out with some other boys to fish, but the other boys would not have him with them, and said,
Go away, foundling.
Hereupon he was much troubled, and asked the old fisherman if that was true. The fisherman told him that once when he was fishing he had drawn him out of the water, so the boy said he would go forth and seek his father. The fisherman, however, entreated him to stay, but he would not let himself be hindered, and at last the fisherman consented. Then the boy went on his way, and walked for many days, and at last he came to a great stretch of water by the side of which stood an old woman fishing. "Good day, mother," said the boy.
Many thanks, said she.
"You will fish long enough before you catch anything."
And you will seek long enough before you find your father. How will you get over the water? Said the woman.
"God knows." Then the old woman took him upon her back and carried him through it, and he sought for a long time, but could not find his father. When a year had gone by, the second boy set out to seek his brother. He came to the water, and all fared with him just as with his brother. And now there was no one at home but the daughter, and she mourned for her brothers, so much so that at last she also begged the fisherman to let her set forth, for she wished to go in search of her brother. Then she likewise came to the great stretch of water, and she said to the old woman, "Good day, mother."
Many thanks,
replied the old woman. "May God help you with your fishing," said the maiden. And when the old woman heard that, she became quite friendly, and carried her over the water, gave her a wand, and said to her,
Go, my daughter, ever onwards by this road, and when you come to a great black dog, you must pass it silently and boldly, without either laughing or looking at it. Then you will come to a great high castle, on the threshold of which you must let the wand fall, and go straight through the castle, and out again on the other side. There you will see an old fountain out of which a large tree is grown, whereon hangs a bird in a cage which you must take down. Take likewise a glass of water out of the fountain, and with these two things go back by the same way. Pick up the wand again from the threshold and take it with you, and when you again pass by the dog, strike him in the face with it, but be sure that you hit him, and then just come back here to me."
The maiden found everything exactly as the old woman had said, and on her way back she found her two brothers who had sought each other over half the world. They went together to the place where the black dog was lying on the road. She struck it in the face, and it turned into a handsome prince who went with them to the river. There the old woman was still standing. She rejoiced much to see them again, and carried them all over the water, and then she too went away, for now she was freed. The others, however, went to the old fisherman, and all were glad that they had found each other again, but they hung the bird on the wall. But the second son could not settle at home, and he took his crossbow and went a-hunting. When he was tired he took his flute and made music. The king was hunting too, and heard that and went thither. And when he met the youth he said, "Who has given you leave to hunt here?" "Oh, no one." "Well, to whom do you belong then?" "Well, I am the fisherman's son." "But the fisherman has no children." "If you will not believe me, come with me." That the king did, and questioned the fisherman, who told him everything, and the little bird on the wall began to sing.
"The mother sits alone, there in a prison small. O king of royal blood, these are thy children all. The sisters twain so false, they wrought the children woe. There in the waters deep, where the fishermen come and go."
Then they were all terrified, and the king took the bird, the fisherman, and the 3 children back with him to the castle, and ordered the prison to be opened, and brought his wife out again. She had grown quite ill and weak, so the daughter gave her some of the water of the fountain to drink, and she became strong and healthy. But the 2 false sisters were burnt, and the daughter went on to marry the prince.